guess when Anna's ready.
I'm ready.
I guess she says she's ready.
Yeah.
So let's do this. Let me add us on Facebook.
Hello. Hello, hello. You hear me? Okay. So I think we have a name now. It's Anna and Rose Ronan's Historical Book Club. Yeah. How's everybody tonight? Sweaty. I don't like it. Okay. So I'm very excited because you with me, Rose? You with me, Roselle?
I'm with you.
Okay. Okay. I'm really excited because I am going to be doing an event for my hero, a guy called Bayard Rustin. So we're going to start off tonight by talking about Bayard.
Let's do it.
Okay. So Bayard Rustin was a black American gay man. He was born in 1912. And for people who do know about him, they know him as a hero of the civil rights movement. But he had been doing direct action and advocating for 25 years before that. And he was a mentor to Dr. Martin Luther King. And he does not get enough credit for that. And the reason that not so many people know about Bayard was because he stepped aside because people threatened the movement. They threatened to expose his homosexuality to discredit the civil rights movement.
Right.
And Martin Luther King turned his back on him. So that's an interesting historical question because we could criticize King for that, but we can also look at the reality of his time and that this was a movement and that this was something big and that I think Bayard Rustin was a brilliant tactician and he would have understood that. But there were other examples in Bayard's life where he needed to step aside because of homophobia. And he worked for the Fellowship for Reconciliation for many years. He was a pacifist. He was a brave, brave man. And he lost his job working for the Fellowship of Reconciliation after he was picked up by the cops in Pasadena for, having sex in a car.
Wow.
Yeah. And he was supposed to, suppress himself. And he was very close to the director of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, a guy called A.J. Musty. It was like a father to him. And so the message he was getting wasn't so much there's something wrong with you, but just like, don't do this. Okay?
Right.
And so that was in 1953, but he'd been doing a lot before then. Bayard started out working with A. Philip Randolph, who started the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters.
Right.
Yeah, and our conference. Okay. Yeah. Here we go. And it's just. Okay, we start talking about an outstanding African-American person that's not too well known, and from there we just keep moving and moving.
Right.
And that was really what got me going on studying history was when I learned about Bayard about 10 years ago. I saw a film called Brother Outsider, and it just made me realize how much is out there that I didn't know about. And So I started learning about Bayard Rustin, and in order to learn about Bayard Rustin, you need to learn about A. Philip Randolph.
Right, right.
And Rustin was raised as a Quaker, and so that's also something that was very important to him. There were...
How many black Quakers do you think was...
A lot.
No, there was a lot back then?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, there was a movement. And actually, I was meaning to look up the major figures in that, and I forgot, but yeah. There's a writer named John Toomer who was a leader for Quaker African Americans. Yeah, so that's a whole nother piece. Okay, next podcast.
Nice.
So, and
opening it up.
Sure, yeah, and Bayard always said that his work in the civil rights movement and in nuclear disarmament and everything was based in being a Quaker and belief in doing good and the value of all of us, of everyone. So the other thing that Bayard was doing, and that, so going back a little bit, he was raised in a big family in Pennsylvania, and he was raised by his grandparents as his parents. When he was older, he found out that his sister was actually his mother, not an uncommon life experience. I think I better hold. I don't know about that. So he was an outstanding student, and even as a high schooler, as a child, he was pushing boundaries of segregation. He would go sit in the movie theater where he wanted to sit, and he had friends of all races. He was just always someone who did his own thing. And he was a talented athlete. He was a talented musician. I mean, the guy could just do anything, pretty much. And so in the night, he went to college and then dropped out, and that may have had something to do with his homosexuality. It's hard to tell. And so he went to New York and joined the Young Communist League. And so, and at that time, the communists were the most socially conscious group that there was.
Right.
And a lot of progressives, just about anybody that was progressive in the 1930s was part of it. It wasn't, and I forget the name of the actual organization, but it wasn't even what we would consider communist or what was considered communism 10 years later. But the issue for Bayard throughout his life was, okay, why are you in this group? Okay, what do you think as a black man in the 1930s? Okay, what are the communists going to do for you? Or like, what are the pacifists going to do for you? And that's just something that just happens all the time now. I mean, people are still going to get pressured, like, okay, you're in this movement, but what about this movement?
What about this movement?
Yeah. So that was what was happening with Bayard, and so he believed that the working for the labor unions, I mean, was working for civil rights, and well, they didn't even really call it civil rights back then. So Bayard was an extremely charismatic and charming person. He was a good speaker and educator. He had lots of friends. And okay, here's the sort of thing that shows you how to look at history more carefully. I was rereading a book about Bayard to prepare for tonight, and I came across something I'd seen before, which was comments from somebody in the Fellowship of Reconciliation saying that Bayard only spent time with white people. And, you know, I remember I wouldn't have paid attention to that when I read the book 10 years ago, but I was looking at it now and I'm thinking like, well, you were one of his white friends, okay?
Right.
So, okay, yeah. Bayard had a life apart from you. To me, he was a social, charismatic person. He always, went all over the place. I'm sure he had plenty of black friends, and I'm sure that, at that time, I'm sure he was friends with other gay black people who would have been closeted, I don't like that word, or who would have been not publicly gay or something. Right. So it's an example of looking at, okay, who's telling you the story? Right. Okay, so Bayard was a conscientious objector in World War II, and that was based on his Quaker belief. And so conscientious objectors could go to farms or something and just be kind of out of the way and do community service sort of stuff. And Bayard decided that he needed to be in the forefront, so he went to prison.
Wow.
Okay, yeah. For his values and ideals. I don't think I would do that. I'm trying to think. Would I?
Well, wasn't prison a little bit different back then?
No, it was bad.
I don't know. It seemed like it wouldn't have been as bad. I don't know.
Really?
I don't know. That's my thoughts.
Oh no! It was pretty bad.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't think I would
like
do it.
prisons nowadays.
Sure.
Gangs and stuff. Like back then, they didn't really have.
Oh, they did.
Like this though, you think it was this? Oh wow. Okay, I didn't know that.
Well, we're going to have, the reason behind a lot of crime in prison is going to be to get stuff. And so the factors that are going to make people get in gangs and prisons have to do with prisons.
Right.
So, yeah, they were always pretty bad. But so Bayard got there and started working on combating segregation in the prison. Okay? He's just, wherever the guy was, he was an activist. He would go sit where he wanted to sit in the cafeteria, whatever they call. I don't know if they call prison cafeterias or whatever. And he taught a class. I don't remember what it was about, to white prisoners, and even that was a big deal. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So he did this to show that being a non-violent pacifist wasn't being a wimp, that non-violence is brave and non-violence is action. Non-violence is not just sitting back and not doing anything. And there was a lot of other conscientious objectors at the prison. The story goes that some white guy came in and started attacking Bayard, and Bayard covered his head and just told the other conscientious objectors not to pull the guy off of him. He was that nonviolent.
Wow.
Yeah. So anyway, so that was all about 1946. Okay, so this was all the stuff Bayard was doing before 1946. And one of the things there is that he was always challenging segregation. That did not start in the 60s by any means. And so in 1946, something called the Morgan decision passed through the Supreme Court, and it's named after a woman named Irene Morgan, who challenged the rules on segregation for interstate buses. So they made it federal law that buses needed to be desegregated.
Right.
So in 1947, Bayard and a group of his associates started something called the Journey of Reconciliation, riding buses across the country and going through Jim Crow states.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And what year was this?
1947.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. You can see why when I learned about this guy, it was just such a light bulb. Like, wow, all of this was happening. There's...
Right.
Yeah.
That's crazy. That's crazy for 1946.
Yeah. So...
You learn something new every day.
You do. You do. And so to step back again from the lesson of Bayard Rustin, there's just so many things to keep looking. I mean, that don't just look at what you've been told. Keep going, keep inquiring. And Bayard was always doing something. And so that was 1947, and then in 1953 was when he was arrested and was fired from the Fellowship of Reconciliation and from the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers. And so then he started working. He was hired by the War Resistance League, and it was a small world, okay? It was a lot of the same people, but people in the War Resistance League were, I don't know, a little bit more down in the mix, you could say, and we're pretty much like, okay, we don't want him, we're not going to ask him to like be sort of like, okay, this is him, okay? And somebody even said Bayard's urges seem unnatural to us, but not to him, and he's an astounding organizer, speaker, educator, everything. We're going to bring him back. So that's what happened. That's what Bayard was doing in the 1950s. But when he was arrested, the head of the Fellowship of Reconciliation sent out letters like notifying all the chapters.
Right.
Okay. But in 1953, it was mixed. Like, he said he did it so that people wouldn't be surprised or whatever by the news, but he could have just not done anything. People wouldn't have known.
Right.
You know, I mean, it's 1950. I mean, it's not like it was going to be posted on Facebook.
Right. Now, considering that he was doing this in 1946, 1950, what were some of his, how should I say, what were some of his sparks growing up that you think made him decide to be like this? You think
his grandmother.
Gotcha.
His grandmother was a Quaker.
Okay.
And so she was very active in that movement, and there were other.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's deep for his grandmother back then. I mean,
It's
so
real
that's a
deep.
long time ago.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's just, so it's kind of like, you could just kind of say it's in his blood.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And there were other, I mean, I believe W.E.B. Du Bois, I mean, there were outstanding African-American leaders that came through his household when he was a child. Same as Malcolm X.
Right, right.
Too. I mean, so, yeah, so that is where it came from. And his grandmother was always very, very close to him. She was waiting for him when he got out of prison.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's good, though.
Yeah.
That's how it's supposed to be.
Yeah. Yeah, and they knew why. We're sad that he did it, but they supported him, what he was doing. So that was the 1950s. And what Bayard was doing he did a lot of traveling. He went and met President Nehru. So Bayard instructed Martin Luther King about Gandhi and nonviolence. I mean, Bayard was there in the 50s. I mean, I think he made his first visit to India in the late 40s. Right. So, and he was visiting other African nations during the 1950s, and they were trying to work on disarmament. I mean, it's just crazy thinking back on, the nuclear war was so real to people then. A bomb had been dropped and they knew about it, but then in the U.S., there was a lot of nationalism, and the pacifists were not that popular at the time because World War II was a good war.
Right.
Like, okay, we were fighting bad guys. And so even amongst the pacifist movement, it was a little bit more difficult to try and communicate what they were doing.
Right. Wow.
Yeah.
So you said you had